when our kids were little or younger, and we allowed our son to do something that his sister didn't think was fair or didn't think was right, and would ask, why does he get to go or do whatever it is we were allowing him to do? Marilyn or I would say, because he's our favorite. Now, before you start judging our parenting skills, you need to know a couple of... The first thing you need to know is that our children are successful, well-adjusted adults, or as well-adjusted as they can be given who their father is. I know some of you were thinking of that, so I thought I'd just go ahead and say it and get it over with. But the second thing you need to know is that when our daughter was allowed to do something that her brother didn't like or didn't think was fair and would ask why, we would say, because she's our favorite. You see, it worked for us. It just leveled everything. I mean, if we gave arguments or we gave reasons why, they could always counter them. But when you say, well, it's because he's our favorite, how do you argue with that? It just worked. At least it did for us. So that in time, when they would protest, they would catch themselves and they'd say, I know, she's your favorite. It worked. Speaking of favorites, do you remember the Smothers Brothers? The singing comedy brother act from the 60s and 70s? If you do you remember what Tommy's standard comeback was whenever he would get into an argument with Dickie, an argument that he knew he was not going to win? It'd get to the point where he knew it was, okay, fold your hands, give up. And he would just kind of look at Dickie with that look that was unique to him, and he'd say, oh yeah? Well, Mom always liked you best. That's one thing to joke about it. It's one thing to tell your kids that the reason you're letting a sibling do something or go someplace is because they're their favorite, your favorite. But it's another thing altogether when parents actually do favor one child over others, as we see in the story of Joseph from our Old Testament lesson for this morning. We learn a number of things about Joseph right off the bat that will explain a lot that happens throughout the stories of Joseph. The first thing we learn is that Joseph is 17 years old. Now, what do you think is so significant about the fact that Joseph is 17 that it is the first thing we're told about him? Well, let me be as tactful as I can and put it like this. Do we remember what we were like when we were 17? We weren't a child anymore, but we weren't an adult yet either. We had some growing up to do. And for some of us, we probably had a lot of growing up to do. And even though we had learned what we thought was a lot in those first 17 years, we didn't know everything yet, did we? We probably didn't know as much as we thought we did. The second thing we're told about Joseph is that he brought a bad report about his brother to their father. In other words, he was a tattletale. And you know what they say about tattletales. Nobody likes a tattletale, especially those who are being tattled on, which happened to be Joseph's brothers. The next thing we learn about Joseph is that he was their father's favorite. I mean, it wasn't a joke. They weren't teasing. Joseph was his father's favorite. This is how the text says it. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph was the son of his old age. And as a sign of his favored status, his father made him a long robe with sleeves, what is commonly referred to as Joseph's coat of many colors. Now, based on what we've learned about Joseph so far, it should come as no surprise to us when we read that his brothers hated him. And just in case we haven't gotten a full picture of what this 17-year-old kid is like, we learn one other thing. and that is that he had a couple dreams, which in hindsight he probably wished he'd have kept to himself. But he didn't. For when he tells his brothers the dreams that he's had, the text says they hated him even more. For they rightly interpret that his dreams mean that one day they will bow down and worship Joseph, that he will rule over them, and that he will reign. So when Joseph later sends him out to find the brothers and to check and see how things are going, because the brothers are tending the herds, or the flocks rather, they see him coming. And they figure, now's our chance. They come up with a scheme whereby they plan to kill him, throw him into a pit, and then tell their father that he had been attacked and devoured by a wild animal. Reuben, who is the oldest of the brothers, says, yeah, he's a pain in the neck. He's troublesome. He's spoiled. We don't like him, but let's not kill him. Throw him into a pit, yeah, but don't harm him. Well, the text says that Reuben said that because he later planned to come and take Joseph out of the pit and then take him safely home. But they're paying. They're eating, and off in the distance they see a caravan of Ishmaelite traders coming. And one of them, Judah, gets the bright idea, yeah, let's not kill him, let's sell him. Let's make a profit off this kid. And so they do. And thus the story of Joseph, the first chapter of the story, ends. A story that will continue for the next 13 chapters in the book of Genesis, leading up to how the people of Israel end up in Egyptian slavery. So what do we take away from this story? A number of things, I think. The first and the most obvious should be that when parents play favorites with their children, one over others, it has bad deal written all over it. And if anybody should have known that, it was Joseph's father. For if you were here and you remember David's sermon, he mentioned that he told you about the story of Jacob in the wrestling match at the river Jabbok. Jacob, that's Israel. His name was changed. And if you know anything about Jacob, you may remember that when Jacob was younger, his mother conspired with him to steal the blessing from his father that rightly belonged to his older brother Esau. And for that trickery, Jacob would spend the next 15 years or so of his life running from his brother. So if anybody knew that playing favorites was not a good idea, that it never turns out right, it should have been Jacob. But he did it anyway. The second takeaway from this story is that I think the story of Jacob here and how he ends up in this pit and what happens to him later is a wonderful case study for anybody who ever finds themselves someplace they don't want to be, and they wonder how in the world they ended up here, or why this happened to them. For when we look at the reasons why Joseph is in the pit and later sold to Ishmaelites and ends up in slavery in Egypt, we see that there is enough blame to go around for everybody in this story. A large part of the blame, yes, has to fall at the feet of Joseph, the father, or Joseph's father, rather, because he loved Joseph more than any of his other kids, a fact which was not lost on the other brothers. And of course, there was the way the brothers acted out their anger and their hatred and their jealousy toward Joseph. But I think Joseph has to assume some of the responsibility for the situation he finds himself in. For the story indicates that it was Joseph's behavior, as much as his father's favoritism, that led his brothers to do what they did. Now, was tattling on his brothers or being immature enough to warrant being thrown into a pit or sold to some Israel or some Ishmaelites? Probably not from our perspective. But understand this, I'm sure you do. We can't control how other people will react to what we say or what we do, which is something that we need to keep in mind. Many an argument or family split first began with something that when we look back on it years later doesn't seem all that significant, if we can even remember what it was at all. I think the reason Joseph ended up being thrown into a pit and then sold and then ended up in slavery explains why a lot of us find ourselves sometimes in situations where we wonder, how did I end up here? Why did this happen to me? Or what's even more inexplicable, why God even allowed it to happen. And that is that usually it's not one reason. It's a number of factors. From my experience, more often than not, when I've sat down and talked with people, and people look for reasons why this or that has happened to them or why they find themselves in this situation or that, it's almost always because of something that somebody else has done to them. It's because of the way their parents raised them. Somebody they thought was their friend took advantage of them or betrayed them. Their boss had it in for them. It's never their fault. Now, there may be some truth to all of those. But what I rarely hear is any sense of responsibility on their part for why they find themselves in the situation they do. In my nearly 40 years of ministry, I can't think of very many people at all who have said to me, you know, Larry, I really blew it. I can't believe I've made such a mess of my life. How could I have ever been so stupid or selfish or immature? Larry, I don't have anybody to blame but myself. The third takeaway, that when we find ourselves in situations that don't seem fair, or that we don't like, or that we don't understand, taking matters into our own hands and forcing something rarely works out the way we think it will. And oftentimes it only makes matters worse. Just ask Adam and Eve when they didn't think, well, I don't know what they were thinking. Well, I know the fruit looked good. But of all the trees they could have had, the one they couldn't have was the one they wanted. They didn't think it was fair. And look what happened. Then too with Cain and Abel, their children. We don't know why Abel's offering to God was acceptable to God and Cain's wasn't. The text doesn't tell us. We just don't know. But we do know what happened when Cain took matters into his own hands and killed his brother. Or then all we have to do is ask Abraham and Sarah. Remember the times as they're passing through on the way to the land that God's going to show them? And Abraham tells his wife, Sarah, to pretend that she's his sister. And the reason for that is that just in the event somebody else, a king, wanted her for his wife, if they know she's married, they'll kill Abraham. If they know she's his sister, they can just take her. I mean, forget the fact. I mean, Abraham, what a model. Tell him you're my sister. That way I live, you know. Or later, when Sarah tells her husband Abraham to father a child through her servant Hagar because she's unable to conceive. You see, Joseph's brothers taking matters into their own hands has a history, a pattern that we see from the very beginning of the Bible, and it never turns out the way they thought it would. Perhaps the author of Proverbs was thinking of Adam and Eve, or Cain and Abel, or Abraham and Sarah, when he or she said, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." Or maybe, just maybe, the author of Proverbs was thinking of Joseph as well. For in the final chapter of Joseph's story, he is reunited with his brothers, who fear that because their father is now dead, Joseph is going to seek revenge for what they did to him. But Joseph tells them, "Do not be afraid. Even though you intended it for harm, God intended it for good." Something the Apostle Paul says slightly different in his letter to the Romans when he says, "We know that in all things God works for good for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose." But that's something Joseph couldn't have possibly known earlier in his life, when his brothers threw him into the pit, or when they sold him to the traders, or when he chose to be faithful to God while he was a servant in Egypt. He served under a man named Potiphar, and Potiphar seduced him, and he ran out of the house in faithfulness to the God he believed in. And out of her humiliation, she turned the story around and accused Joseph, landing Joseph in jail. Folks, I think it's oftentimes the same for you and me. We may have no idea why we're going through whatever it is we happen to be going through. We may not know why we're in the situation we're in. We may not understand why this or that has happened to us, or even more inexplicable, why God has allowed it to happen, at least at the time we're going through it. Like Joseph, it may be years before we can see how the individual pieces of the puzzle of our lives fit together to make a whole. And how and why God allowed this or that to happen to us, if we're permitted to find out. Because the truth is, sometimes we're not. Sometimes we don't know why things happen the way they do. But whether we ever understand or not is not the question. The question is, regardless of whether the situation we happen to find ourselves in seems right or fair or not, what are we going to do about it? Will we take matters into our own hands and force our own will? Or will we trust in the Lord with all of our hearts and not rely on our own insight? And in all of our ways acknowledge him, trusting that he will make straight our paths. May it be so.